Okay, welcome back to House Education, Wednesday, February 12th, 2025. Turning our attention to Act 168, which was our BOCES or Boards of Cooperative Education Services bill that we passed last year. Just to remind everybody, it was sort of enabling language. It didn't have money attached to it, didn't have staff attached to it, but it allowed folks to sort of get rolling. We're here for an update to ask some questions that the field has given us to think about and see where we go from here. Anyway, it looks like you have a presentation or a document.
We have a document.
Yeah.
I was like, we.
Would you like to go over that, or are you just waiting for questions, or do you have some comments you'd like to make beforehand? Just to give us an update.
So Jill Briggs Campbell, interim deputy secretary.
For the record, Lindsay Hedges. I am the interim director of policy and communications.
I think we can give just kind of a brief update on sort of where we're at. And then I think really, just some questions. And I think we have some opportunity to think through how we might move forward in a really productive way. Go ahead, Lindsay.
So I know you all heard from the field last week about Act 168, which established Boards of Cooperative Education Services, or BOCES. And we wanted to provide a bit more kind of background and general overview before we dig into how we're thinking about considerations in a future state. So Act 168 passed last session, aimed to enhance educational opportunities, operational efficiencies, and allowed SUSDs to collaborate with shared services, programs, and resources. And there's a few steps that needed to occur before a BOCES could be formally stood up. First being that SUSDs had to come together to vote to explore the formation of a BOCES. They have to negotiate on articles of agreement, which I think you heard a little bit last week as something that folks are looking for some support around, just given that it's potentially a time and labor intensive initiative. They then have to vote on those articles of agreement, and then those articles get sent up to the Secretary of Education for review. The Secretary can provide edits and feedback before signing off on those articles. And then at that point, once the articles have been approved by the Secretary of Education, the BOCES can apply for a startup grant of $10,000. To date, the Secretary has not signed off on the formation of any BOCES, and no startup grants have been awarded. But we know that there are conversations around the state, particularly in the southern regions, of groups that have begun to have these conversations. We also know that there's some barriers to implementation, including budget constraints and lack of capacity at the state level. And so we at the agency have been engaged with the Vermont Learning Collaborative, who has really been leading those efforts down in the southern region of the state. And they've provided us with really robust model articles of agreement to provide as a resource for the field. And so I've had the pleasure of meeting with Jill and walking through those, and they're really robust, good starting place. We just need to make sure from the state level that we are taking into consideration all of the fiscal, legal, programmatic kind of implications in the model articles of agreement before we're releasing them out to the field as a resource to use. And moving forward, the AOE also has a contractor on board right now that has some national expertise in the BOCES framework. So we are a little bit better positioned at this point to start moving forward that work in a more meaningful way. Anything to add?
Yeah, so luckily we do have new solutions who you're going to be hearing from on Friday. They happen to, as Lindsay said, be a national leader on the use of BOCES, particularly to improve the delivery of special education services and support. They actually were working with VT, the Vermont Learning Collaborative, as they were putting together their own kind of framework. So there's a nice kind of synergy there, and it's a group that really knows the Vermont context very well. I think that we've talked about this already, and particularly last week, that 168 was, I really think, a well-intentioned to try to address a real need. At the time, the agency had expressed concern, and I still do have that concern, that we're adding complexity on top of an already complex system, but I understand the reasoning behind it, right? We all sort of agree that because our system doesn't operate at scale, that bringing regional scale to the delivery of particular services and supports makes sense. Where, to be frank, I'm sort of stuck is how do we move forward as we're contemplating big change? As Lindsay knows, and the Learning Collaborative know, and those districts, I said that to them when we were meeting. I said, I'm not sure where we're going in the next year or two. And so it's sort of hard to, sort of continue to rush headlong into the creation of something that may not be the right move at this point. So I do think that's where that conversation should, kind of happen. And in our presentation last week, in the governance presentation, I've really been sort of thinking about this, and Lindsay and I have been thinking about this as we move forward. I do think that there is a role for an education service agency or a BOCES, maybe multiple in our system. I think it behooves us to sort of take a step back and think about, as we're looking at changes in government scale, where are those gaps? And then the other consideration is there are multiple ways to structure a BOCES or an education service agency. The current structure in 168 is really districts sort of organically creating this. There's other ways to do this, and I think we should contemplate them. There's ways to do it that have more tight coordination with the state. There's different funding structures. In other states, the funding comes as like a categorical grant directly from the state. We're sort of contemplating that with CTE BOCES. So I do think there's an opportunity to take this idea, which I think is a good one and serves a really important purpose. And as maybe you all are contemplating different changes in the system, what is that key role? So it puts us in a little bit of a weird spot. And I think it puts folks like the Learning Collaborative and the Southeast, which is really by far the furthest along here, in a bit of a weird spot. And so I think that's sort of, maybe where we have that conversation on what do we do at this point.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and certainly willing to acknowledge the same, that we are our current reality, and then we're talking a lot about changes. The proposal with the ESAs, I think we still don't really have a very good grasp on, and frankly, we're working off of a short form bill when that even shows up. So we also are sort of like having to think in two different tracks. We've got, like, if we are working within the system that we have today, what changes need to be made to move this along. I think many of us would like to see the ability of one BOCES to be formed, to see how it's a kind of a good pilot. On the other hand, we've got a lot of discussion in what is the future world going to look like. So just to say, yeah.
Yeah. Same.
One of the thoughts, let's just stay on the current system, no big changes in the future. Just to think on that path. The Learning Collaborative basically comes down to money. They were wondering about, well, can't we have access to the $10,000 grant in order to form articles of agreement, because they require lawyers and a lot of expense, and nobody's ready to get money for that. And this, I guess, is really a question for you in terms of like what's better, money now or money later, but more is that accurate? They don't have access to the money until they have approved articles of agreement, looking at this as the NAs.
Yeah, and Lindsay, you dug into this a little bit. There's actually a workflow issue in 168 that is preventing that stuff. So,
yeah. No, I mean, without the language in front of me, I want to reference that specifically. But yeah, my understanding is that the startup grant is not available to a BOCES until the secretary has signed off on the articles of agreement.
All right, and so they have articles of agreement. They did create them, and they currently are in what step of the process?
If they want to formally submit them to the secretary for approval, we could move forward with that process. We would then need to create a grant program. So we can do that. I think where we've been is, I would say, more in a step of like sort of conversation, and I will, like, full disclosure, as I said, I've really been cautioning them, like, oh, I'm not sure if you all should be moving forward. You've done a ton of work in this space, but I am very cautious about, I take your point about the idea of having an example of this, but it would take a tremendous amount of work for them to actually stand this up. It would change their special ed delivery. And I am cautious about putting them in a situation where we might say a year from now, or even by the end of the session, this is no longer a relevant construct. So we could move forward, but I'm not, I have real concerns about doing that. I don't know that we're setting everybody up for success here.
I guess I would say we have a law, we have a process in that law. That's the reality we're working with. Representative Brady.
I'm really concerned about what's happening here. It feels like the legislature passed a law to create a structure for BOCES that the agency at the time supported. We know the field supports because it is a potential tool. It is not the end all be all, but it is a potential tool towards some scale and some efficiency and some regionalization. And I'm not sure which organization it is, but I think we have testimony. There's at least one group whose articles of agreement are sitting at the agency and waiting for action. And I don't understand the legislative process enough, I guess. We can pass a bill, it becomes law, and then it can be held up because there's a potential for larger change that's theoretical right now. This feels like this feels like a really slippery slope we're in right now, and it's a small thing, but if we're saying that we can't move forward on enacted policies and laws and grant programs for anything in the field because we don't know what the future will be, I'm losing sight a bit of how the whole process works here and what's happening in the field. That there's an articles of agreement, I think, waiting for approval.
So I think that's a bit of a mischaracterization of what I was saying. So I'll take a step back because I probably wasn't explaining myself as well as I should have. So I'm signaling in an informal way my own sort of thinking around this, which we had discussed kind of at the beginning, was maybe part of the conversation today. On the formal and implementation of 168, I think we can all recognize, as Rep. Conlon pointed out, that there was no resources identified for this in the agency, and that we had signaled very clearly last session that there was no one in the agency who had any expertise around the formation of the BOCES, and no resources were identified to do. So over the course of the fall, which is when the conversations with the Learning Collaborative have happened, we have identified that. We've had multiple meetings with them, and they've been really, I think, good partners in this. In bringing on new solutions for different work, we identified that they actually had a great deal of expertise in this area. And so we are leveraging that expertise to support the implementation of Act 168. So I think it's really, I want to be very clear about the two different kind of conversations that we're having. So we do have articles of agreement that have been, I would say, informally submitted, and we can go back to the Learning Collaborative and actually go back to those districts and ask for the formal submission to the Secretary for review. It would then require that we had expertise within the agency that would be able to review those articles of agreement, including what are the kind of fiscal implications, legal implications, and be able to respond back with some level of knowledge and expertise on whether or not we should approve, whether or not there's any concerns. We can, at this point in time, leverage our consultants, which we have brought on for a different purpose, but we're willing to use to support this work because no resources were identified. I just want to clarify those two different. In addition, I think that it behooves us to have a conversation around how we might conceive of the BOCES or an education service agency future state. So I'm not in any way saying, no, we shouldn't move forward with this and it shouldn't be characterized.
Representative Brown.
So are we hearing a commitment to move forward with the work of BOCES as the law is currently written and envisioned?
If that's what, I mean, I think I'm here. Going to say again, we just now have been able to bring on some expertise. I don't know, and I need to go back and understand the degree to which we need additional expertise within the agency. I can't have a consultant reviewing articles of agreement and having the secretary sign off and make a recommendation on that. I can ask our general counsel to review, and certainly they will. We can ask our finance department to review, and certainly they will. And we can then identify whether or not we have sort of the appropriate expertise. But the articles of agreement we've had for a month or so.
Is the lack of expertise, is that a vacancy issue? In other words, are there posted jobs that would bring the expertise necessary to deal with this?
I mean, in other states, there's usually some sort of staff or team at the state agency that is responsible for coordination on this. So not entirely sure how to answer that question. I don't have any posted job that says
Well, I
BOCES
just think,
coordinator.
no, I realize that, and I don't think we need a BOCES coordinator for one BOCES. But I am wondering about, are there positions at the AOE legally, financially, that would normally be available to review this, and those vacancies are just unfilled?
No, I wouldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it as such.
Taylor?
Just curious of what is envisioned of the ESA that would be different from a BOCES?
So I spoke to this a bit last week. So if we are contemplating future states, so let me draw a line so we're really clear. We're not talking about 168 at this point. We're talking about future state, potentially. We're contemplating a different governance structure. Then I think it does make sense to ask the question, for example, if it was the 5-district structure that we proposed, to what degree, since those are already regional in nature, you would want regional BOCES or an education service agency providing those same services? The answer may be yes, you still do want special education services coordinated by BOCES, or a statewide special education BOCES, or a statewide CTE, or potentially a statewide education service that would provide professional development on critical areas like literacy and math. So states use education service agencies or BOCES in a variety of ways. And I keep saying ESAs because that's the umbrella term, and BOCES is a very specific construct. So I'm trying to expand our thinking a little bit. So currently 168 has districts forming a BOCES. If we're operating at a different scale, is that still the right construct? And I think it's worth a question. And as I said, in other states, you can just fund directly, like through a categorical grant, to the professional development education service agency that's going to provide these services across the field. So I think it's just a different construct, and it's worthwhile to have the question. And I think that once we understood what direction the legislature wanted to take in terms of the overall scale and organization of the system, then if you're being methodical, you would then say, where are the gaps in the delivery of service and support that is not necessarily appropriate, or the statewide, the Agency of Education is not positioned to provide, and the districts can't provide. And that's the gap where you fill in with the ESA. Right now with 168, because of the scale of our those regional kind of sped BOCES, if that's what they were going to organize, do make sense. There is a clear gap that needs to be served. So I think that's
So basically, there's an agreement that we are gonna move forward with some kind of system for shared services, just the construct of it, and depending on.
I mean, that's what we're sort of proposing, is I do think that there is a construct, but fundamentally, like how you fund it, what the relationship is between, say, the agency, a BOCES or an ESA, and the districts, like that actually all drives specific goals. So those are actually choices that matter. And so my suggestion was, as you all are moving forward, with whatever proposal you're going to sort of adopt, that you do sort of think about in a really methodical way, where are those gaps? And then what are the specific goals, the measurable goals that you want an ESA to achieve? And then that should inform the sort of structure and the funding.
As we sort of work through our future state, current state tension, the clock is ticking. So, you know, the 5-district proposal that's been put before us exists only currently in a short form bill that isn't in our committee yet. It's I assume headed here very soon. But there are so many, and we'll get into this in our next session. But it's we've got a group ready to go addressing one of the most important issues we have, which is the high cost of extraordinary services for special education. And a move, even if we were to move to a 5-district state, which I think I would qualify as somewhat unlikely, that's still going to take several years to even figure out all of the language of what are the powers of a 5-person school board that oversees one of these things. And so I guess I'm just concerned that we are holding up what could be a model example unnecessarily. And if the consequence is that we move, that ultimately it becomes irrelevant, I'm always a big fan of when nonprofit organizations become irrelevant because we solved the problem. But they need to. Jill.
Yeah, I have a question, and then again, a really I think grave concern for our committee. The question would be, so 168 is law, and whether it's implementation of 168, which is now existing law, or the secretary's vision of ESAs, which we've seen signaled as a future state, is it safe to assume then that we're going to see in the budget request resources at AOE to implement those things? If we don't have them now and we're relying on a consultant, and that's an inferior way to do it.
Yes, so the budget request includes a request for significant resources to support education transformation. And if part of that does contemplate a role for education service agencies or BOCES, that would be something that we would need to resource.
That's my second question again, and maybe it's more for like council, is and I'm perhaps overreacting, but I'm feeling like there is a tension here that is becoming more clear. If we're all discussing a potential future state, there's a sort of broad strokes proposal from the governor. There's been a lot of policy ideas brought to our committee. We know we're weighing a lot of things. None of those have happened yet. They will go through a lengthy legislative process and, more importantly, difficult work of implementation in the field. We still have to live in the real world and in current day. And so I'm concerned that we're saying we're going to just sort of suspend the things that are supposed to be happening on a day-to-day basis because we don't know what the future of our state brings. So still have to open, they still have to function. BOCES are supposed to be, when an article of agreement is sent to the agency, considered and approved or disapproved. Like this feels like a concern, a pretty big concern about the implementation of existing law and an inability to sort of function in the moment we're in while we plan for the future. We'd all love to stop time and just plan for the future, but we can't do that. So we've got to live in the constructs of what's already there.
So can I respond to that? Because now it's been said twice.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure how else to characterize to respond other than how I have. So 168 was passed with no resources or expertise within the agency to do this work. It is new work. It is not anything that the state has done before. We signaled that when the bill is being passed. We've been working actively with the Vermont Learning Collaborative as a way actually to inform ourselves. And that's work that Lindsay and I took on because there was no resources appropriated and no expertise identified within the agency. So we have used it as an opportunity to better run about how this work could be done. As it turned out, serendipitously, they had utilized the services of New Solutions in their own work. We were using that work to better be able to support other districts as they're doing this work. And I would say the Learning Collaborative has been a really great partner. We received the articles of agreement in an informal way a month ago. So that is the actual timeline in which we're operating. So we are meeting with the Learning Collaborative again, and we need the districts to submit the formal articles of agreement, at which point we can do that review. Once we have received those, then we will be working within the agency to identify who within the agency has the expertise to be able to evaluate the articles of agreement and have the secretary approve or not. So again, I think actually working within the real timeline of what's happened and distinguishing between the two conversations we're having today, one of which is an update on the work of 168, and one was, my understanding, was a more informal conversation about how we might conceive of this future state. So I do think it's a mischaracterization to say that we are not moving forward with this work. We haven't been sitting idle and not doing anything. But again, no resources were identified for this. If it was something that we had decided as a state that was a direction that we needed to go in, then we do have to identify that we have to build expertise within the agency to do this work, and that it's new work for the agency and it doesn't happen.
I appreciate that. I think that when we passed the bill, part of it was to see what sort of interest there was before potentially staffing up the AOE.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Is there, what other conversations are going on around other things besides the Learning Collaborative? Are there active?
Around
Oh,
BOCES?
Yeah.
So I do think that SPED is the focus. We've also seen on the southwest side that there are some districts who are really looking at the work on the southeast side as a model. And so, as I said, we really kind of used this as an opportunity for us to better understand how we could support this work. And our intention is to take those articles of agreement once we have an opportunity to review them and understand, and again, to leverage a consultant that we brought on for an entirely different purpose, but we are using to support the work to move it forward, to understand if that is a good template, in which case the agency would be able to provide a template for other. So we are building capacity because we see that there's a need to do so, and we're doing it within our own resources.
Appreciate that, and the clarity on the process is also appreciated. Any other questions? We're gonna do, yeah, go ahead. Representative Wong, do you have one? And if you don't, that's okay.
I do. Are we sort of wrapping this is related, but not specific to BOCES?
Well, we are
I
about,
mean, it is related.
yeah, we'll.
Not
Shall
really.
we for the next session?
It is, well,
Go ahead.
let me ask it. Thank you.
Can I say, we'll stick a pin on it for?
No,
15 minutes?
this is actually related to budget. And so I'm curious, I don't know whether we're gonna see budget proposals happen, because I've been hearing it may not happen, but if it does that include the spreadsheet of the staffing levels at the AOE and how many vacancies we have in the AOE? Will we be seeing that in a budget proposal? And also, I'm going back to my earlier years on the education committee, and typically when a budget proposal comes in, there's usually a big spreadsheet on the staffing levels. I'm
Okay,
just
so
really
that
curious about that.
Data.
And, well, yeah. And you mentioned about using consultants. Just curious about whether we'll be seeing that as well. How many consultants we're using, sort of related. If we don't have staff, we employ consultants to come in and help us, and we'll be seeing that as well. This is just, related to all of these questions, and budgets coming, so.
And I just want to provide an update to everybody.
Thank you.
We were scheduled to have a budget presentation. The chief financial officer at the AOE is under the weather.
Okay.
So that's going to be postponed.
So that's
So
just,
we can include, as in our budget presentations, the current staffing levels and vacancies. And then you would like to know comprehensively the use of consultants?
I'm going to look to our chair at the top of the table about how deep we want to go, but I'm speaking for myself,
I
not,
think they're going to entertain the request.
I would,
Yeah. So I just
Like to
want to
get a
distinguish
sense.
between to ensure that we're meeting your needs. So I think what I heard, but please let me know if I've misunderstood. You were interested to know if we have brought on consultants to
No.
support vacancies?
no, I'm curious about the use of consultants and how much we have employed consultants. And if that's related to vacancies, fine. If it's
Yeah.
not, that's fine too. It doesn't really matter. It would be nice to know if it was related to that, but you know, we've certainly seen quite a bit of use of consultants here, and I'm just curious about what the level is. Hard to know without looking at it in a budget. Thanks.
Let's pause, take 10 minutes, my benefit. And we will